Have you been thinking about giving up on proprietary corporate operating systems and choosing something free and open source? And have you just realized that you cannot just switch to Linux because there are many different distributions of the Linux kernel which are all operating systems by their own right? Well, in today's video I would like to talk about how to choose a distribution that fits your needs, because I know that especially for a new user it can be overwhelming. You can feel like you have just too many choices to choose from, and well, making the right choice seemed to be an impossible feat before you even had like your first step in the Linux world. So in this video I would like to give you some aid in what things you should consider while making this choice. So first let's talk about what Linux distributions are. So in this context we are talking about different operating systems that are based on the Linux kernel, usually use the GNU core utils, so like a GNU Linux distributions. And so what is a different distribution is generally a branding issue and can mean many things. Basically, different distributions are generally considered like these different Linux-based operating systems that have been prepared by different developers, or maybe it can be even like the same developers want to differentiate two different types of their operating systems. They can call them separate distributions sometimes. Distributions can have like bases. There are some distributions that have been built up from zero, from the ground up, and there are some distributions that borrow elements, more or less elements from other distributions, and just switch out the parts they don't like, switch out some parts to fit their own purpose, and this can be called like different bases. So for example, Arch Linux is the base distribution for Manjaro. They switched out a few parts from Arch Linux, they distributed in a different way, and that's how they made their own distribution. Or for example, Ubuntu is based on Debian, so they switch out a few things from Debian and package it as like Ubuntu, and Ubuntu can have different versions with different default settings. So for example, Ubuntu can have like the different flavors. There is the official or the main flavor which provides you with the GNOME desktop as the default, but there is also Kubuntu which comes with a KDE desktop. And well, multiple distributions are on the same base, but they use slightly different defaults because they just want to provide different users with different defaults. So you could just install the base Ubuntu and just switch out the things you don't like by yourself, but the Ubuntu developers think it's a better idea to have separate flavors of this operating system, which they can just make it very easy for the people with the different taste in these defaults, or maybe a different taste in what they consider a good desktop environment. They can just download the version that they like. And so a distribution is generally defined. Basically, the biggest distinction can be the schedule and method of updating. So you must have heard a lot about rolling and static distributions, or sometimes they are called like bleeding edge and stable. So here the stable is generally just means that we have a stable base which does not change often. So the static is a word that I prefer, because stable in a lot of people's mind means that it's a program that is like trustworthy and it doesn't freeze on you and something like that. But rolling releases can also be very stable in that sense, but they are not static. They are updating quite often. That's why they are called rolling, because every time a new version of a software has been developed by the developers, they will just roll out the updates as fast as possible, while in the static release case they try to keep the thing like unchanged from the user's perspective for a long time and provide the user with like the same environment throughout the life of the operating system. So it's more based on the stability in terms of like the experience, so the same experience for the user. There are also very big difference in repositories. Of course, the repository is like the central server or servers that contain all the files that you need for your distribution, for your operating system to run. And usually, besides the main operating system components, Linux repositories also have a bunch of programs. Most programs that you would like to use, most applications you would like to use on your computer will be in one of these repositories that usually come with your distribution. And of course, what programs are available, that will be different by distribution, because the distribution maintainers can choose which will be the programs they will package for their users. And of course, based on their release schedule, they can also decide what versions are they going to put in those repositories. There is also the package manager. The package manager is generally the program that will check the repositories and download the programs from the repositories and install it on your system. And so package managers can be very different in different distributions. So for example, Arch Linux uses Pacman, Debian uses apt, and then some of the other distributions use other methods, other package managers. But basically all package managers do is they download the software you need from the repository and install it on your system. That's like a 1,000-foot overview of what a package manager does. And well, based on how your distribution works and how your package manager works, like there can be like different methods to install foreign programs. So sometimes you need software that is not in the repositories, so the distribution maintainers didn't package that software for some reason. And what is the method? So that can be very different from distribution to distribution. There are some methods that work for all distributions, and there are some methods that are only work in certain ones. So for example, in Arch Linux you have the Arch user repository, which you can use to basically build the programs on your machine and package them for yourself. And you can use the same method to package things that are not even in the Arch user repository. You can just make like a build script, something like that, and you can install foreign packages like that. But in a lot of Debian based distributions, especially Debian Ubuntu, you can just add additional repositories which are not managed by the developers of the distributions but are managed by the developers of the certain software. So that's another kind of difference between these different distributions. And of course the defaults, so some distributions will not come with any defaults. So Arch Linux famously comes with like 0 defaults. You have to build your system from the ground up. Gentoo is also very similar in that manner, and a lot of other distributions offer you like a default desktop environment, default applications. So for example, an Office suite is already installed with your operating system, and the themes, so they look different, and some look more pretty for you and some will look ugly for you. So that's also kind of can be a difference between different distributions. So what are the parameters that you should consider? Because based on this, like, okay, so these things are different in these different distributions, but it's not going to be too much of a help to use this information for choosing a distribution before you actually start using Linux, in my opinion. So I wanted to give you a rundown on what parameters you should consider. So first of all, the kernel version. So what is the Linux kernel that is provided with that operating system? So the Linux kernel is constantly being developed. It is, I think it's almost like every month or every 2 months there is like a major update in the kernel. And so if you are using just like a plain, not special, maybe 2-year-old computer, then doesn't really matter because the kernel will support your hardware. But if you are using like very modern, very new equipment, so you have like the newest graphics card or newest processor, then you would want to choose a distribution that gives you the newer kernel versions. So for example, in that case, or maybe you have some esoteric hardware like weird mouse or something like that, because those kind of the general use peripherals will have a driver in the kernel quite fast, but things that are only used by fewer people, those kind of drivers usually get into the kernel slower. So if you are falling into that category, you should try to choose a distribution that provides you with the newest kernel. So those are like Arch or Manjaro or maybe OpenSUSE, Tumbleweed. So in that case, a distribution with a rolling release would be preferable if you need the newer kernel versions. If you don't, if you have like a very basic desktop computer and you just use it for very simple things, then you won't need the newer kernels. The package availability is, I think, very, very important. So if you decided that you want to be a free software enthusiast and you'll use free software only, so there are some distributions that offer you repositories with only free software. I think like Parabola is like one of the most famous examples of that. But most people will be okay with proprietary software, so yeah, that's basically most mainline distributions will have proprietary software in their repositories. But you should also check whether the programs that you want to use are available in the repository of the distribution that you plan to use. And that usually you can check on their homepages. So most of the distributions will have like a package search function somewhere on their homepage, so you can just use a web search engine, type in the name of the software and the name of the distribution, and you will probably find out whether that software is available from the official repositories or not. So you also should consider the learning curve. Are you more kind of a person who likes convenience and wants to just install the system and just use it as it is, and you want that system to be as convenient for you to use as possible? Or maybe you are more of the kind of the person who wants to have very granular control of your computer. So some of the distributions will offer you installation process that will let you just build your system from the ground up. So for example, the Debian or Ubuntu case, you can get just like a minimal server install and then just build up your system from the command line from that. Or Arch Linux doesn't even have any other option. So Arch Linux only goes the ground up way. Or if you want things to just work, then you can grab like just a regular Ubuntu or Kubuntu or some other graphical flavor of Ubuntu, or Manjaro if you prefer the rolling release version. And you can generally take a look at their live environment, because you just boot your live USB and you will see exactly how the default looks, because what it will install in your computer, that will look very similar to how the live environment looks like. And in that you can look around, and if you didn't figure out whether the software is available in the repositories, probably you can just use the live environment, and there is usually some kind of a graphical package manager that you can use to figure out what are the software that is available on that distribution. Also, if you like to have a very specific configuration, then you're probably better if you just build your system from ground up, because if you install a system that has very specific default settings already applied, then maybe changing all those defaults back to to the thing that you want to use might be even more work than if you just install it by yourself from the command line and just add in all the things one by one that you want to use. And the most important thing I left for the end of this list is that the community support. So you should not use, especially if you are a beginner, so it's your first time installing a Linux distribution, do not install a distribution that has a small user base and a small developer base. You need to install a Linux distribution that is used by a lot of people, and if you have any problems, there will be a lot of people who will be able to help you. So community support is generally very good for Ubuntu or Linux Mint, and I would argue that even very good for Arch Linux if you have the correct mentality on there. So Arch Linux requires a specific attitude if you want to try Arch Linux. I have a video about whether Arch Linux is a good idea to try out or to use as a Linux newbie, and you can check that out if you're interested in Arch Linux. But anyways, check out whether they have a forum on the distribution homepage, whether that forum has recent messages, how well the questions are answered on those forums, because well, you might need some help with your Linux journey sometime, and you don't want to be stuck in a distribution where there are like 2 developers working on the whole thing and only 40 people use it, and no one else have the same hardware configuration and no one else wants to use the same software that you are trying to make work on your computer. So that is the most important point. And this is my suggestion on how to approach choosing the right Linux distribution. I didn't want to give like very specific suggestions on specific distributions because well, you have to find what works for you, and if you found this information in this video useful, then please consider giving me a thumbs up and suggesting this video to your friends who are considering switching to Linux but don't know how to approach choosing the right distribution. And well, if you want to see more videos of me, consider subscribing to this channel, and if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them down below. As always, let's get into an argument on the internet about something, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye!